Arthur Vance sat in the middle of his large living room feeling like a stranger in his own home. The house was very quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy and presses against your ears. Outside, the autumn wind was blowing dry leaves against the window, making a scratching sound, but inside there was nothing. Just dust motes dancing in the light that came through the heavy curtains. Arthur looked around the room. On the walls there were framed certificates and gold records. They were proof of who he used to be. He was a famous composer, a man who had conducted orchestras in grand halls all over the world. People used to clap for him until their hands hurt. Now, the only sound in the house was the ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece, counting away the seconds of his life. But there was another sound too. It was a sound inside Arthur's head. It was a tune, a simple, looping melody that had been stuck in his mind for weeks. It wasn't annoying him. No, it was haunting him. It was beautiful, like a ghost that wouldn't leave. He could hear a piano playing it, clear as day, but he didn't know what the song was. He didn't know if he had written it years ago or if he had heard it somewhere and forgotten. The worst part was that he knew this song meant something important. It felt like the answer to a question he couldn't remember asking. Arthur closed his eyes and tried to grab the melody, to hold it still and look at it. Da-da-dum, da-da-dum. It was sad but hopeful at the same time. He reached for the small digital voice recorder sitting on the table next to his armchair. His hands shook a little bit as his fingers wrapped around it. The doctors called it cognitive decline, a fancy way of saying his memory was leaking out of him like water from a broken cup. He was terrified that one day he would wake up and the music would be gone. He wouldn't even remember that he had lost it. He pressed the record button. A small red light blinked on. He cleared his throat, which felt dry and scratchy. "It's in a minor," Arthur whispered into the machine, his voice sounding thin and old. "Or maybe F major. The left hand is heavy, like footsteps. The right hand is light, like rain." He hummed the first few bars. It sounded perfect. But then, the melody in his head swerved, taking a turn he couldn't follow. He stopped humming. The silence rushed back in, louder than before. He groaned in frustration and hit the stop button. He had been doing this for weeks, recording bits and pieces, playing them back, and hating them because they weren't right. They were just shadows of the music in his mind. A few days ago, Arthur had decided he couldn't do this alone. He had gathered his courage and called the best people he knew. He had invited 3 experts to his house. He had known them for years. They were professors of music theory, historians who specialized in classical music, and a young pianist who was considered a genius. Arthur had poured them tea and served them expensive cookies, treating them like royalty, hoping they could help him. He remembered how that meeting had gone. The air in the room had smelled of stale tea and arrogance. The experts had sat on his expensive sofa, looking very serious. They had leaned forward to listen to the tiny speaker on his recorder. Arthur had pressed play. The small, mechanical voice of the recorder filled the room. Da-da-dum, da-da-dum. Then it stopped. The pianist, a young man with very slick hair, had frowned. He tilted his head to the side like a dog listening to a whistle humans can't hear. "It's unresolved," the pianist had said. He used a lot of big words to explain why he didn't like it. He talked about dissonance and counterpoint. He said the melody didn't follow the rules of music theory. To him, because it didn't fit in a textbook box, it was wrong. It was just noise. Then the music historian had adjusted his glasses and shaken his head. "It doesn't match any known folk tunes from the last century, Arthur," the man had said, sounding bored. "It's likely just an earworm. Maybe you heard a commercial on television and your brain is mixing it up." Arthur had felt his face get hot. "I wrote symphonies," he had told them, his voice trembling. "I know the difference between a commercial jingle and a masterpiece. This song, it feels like it belongs to me." The experts had exchanged looks. They didn't say it, but Arthur could see it in their eyes. They saw a confused old man who was grasping at straws. They didn't hear the beauty. They only heard the mistake. They had left an hour later, patting him on the back and telling him to rest. They had taken his hope with them out the front door. Now, Arthur sat alone again. He looked at the recorder. He hated it. He hated that his brilliant mind had come to this, relying on a piece of plastic to catch his own thoughts. The fear was rising in his chest, tight and heavy. What if the experts were right? What if the song was just a symptom of his sickness? What if he was losing his mind, note by note? He needed to get out. The walls of the house were closing in on him. The certificates on the walls felt like they were laughing at him. He grabbed his coat and his cane. The coat was heavy in wool, smelling slightly of mothballs. He struggled with the buttons, his fingers fumbling and clumsy, which only made him angrier. Finally, he got it buttoned up. He stood up, his knees popping, and grabbed his keys. He walked out into the crisp afternoon air. The sky was gray, full of clouds that looked like old wool. He didn't drive. He didn't trust himself behind the wheel anymore. He walked slowly down the sidewalk, tapping his cane on the concrete. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like a heartbeat. He walked past houses where families were living. He saw a young father teaching his son to ride a bike. He saw a woman watering her plants. Normal life. It was all moving so fast, while Arthur felt like he was stuck in mud. He kept walking until the houses turned into shops. He didn't know where he was going, not really. He just knew he couldn't go back there and sit in that quiet room with the ghost song. Then he saw it. A neon sign buzzing in the window. It was a diner. Not a fancy restaurant. It was a simple place with a glass front door and a sign that said open. Through the window, he could see people sitting on red stools. He could see steam rising from coffee cups. It looked noisy and messy and full of life. Arthur hesitated. He wasn't used to places like this. But the thought of sitting alone in the dark was worse than the noise. He took a deep breath and pulled the heavy door open. A bell dinged above the door. Instantly, the smell of bacon and fried potatoes hit him. It was a warm, greasy, wonderful smell. The room was loud with the clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversations. It was perfect. It was the opposite of his living room. Arthur walked to a booth in the back corner, away from the door. He sank onto the vinyl seat, which squeaked under his weight. He laid his cane on the table and let out a long breath he didn't know he was holding. He watched the people. A waitress in a pink uniform zoomed by with a tray of food. 2 truck drivers laughed loudly over their plates. Arthur felt invisible here. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew he used to be famous. They just saw an old man in a coat. It was a relief. He closed his eyes for a second, and the melody was there, waiting for him. Da-da-dum, da-da-dum. It was still playing. He tapped his fingers on the table. He was tired of thinking. He just wanted the noise to stop. He looked up and saw the waitress coming toward him. She didn't look like an expert. She didn't look like a critic. She just looked like someone who worked hard. Arthur didn't know it yet, but he was exactly where he needed to be. The waitress was named Elena, though nobody in the diner really called her that. To the cooks, she was order up. To the regulars, she was just honey or dear. She didn't mind. Elena had worked at this diner for 15 years, ever since she moved to the city looking for a fresh start. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun that made her face look kind but tired, and the pink uniform she wore had seen better days. The hem was fraying a little bit, and there was a small stain on the pocket from a ketchup bottle that exploded last Tuesday. But she walked with energy, weaving between the tables like she was dancing. Carrying 3 plates of pancakes in one hand and a pot of coffee in the other, it was the lunch rush, which was the hardest part of the day. The diner was packed. Every seat at the counter was taken. And the booths were full of people on their lunch breaks or construction workers looking for a hot meal. The air was thick with the smell of frying onions, melted butter, and strong coffee. The noise level was high. You could hear the clatter of silverware hitting plates, the hiss of the grill from the kitchen, and the sound of people talking over each other. Elena was in the zone. She cleared a table near the window, wiping away the crumbs with a quick, practiced motion. She smiled at the customers, even though her feet were throbbing inside her sneakers. Being a waitress was hard work. It wasn't just serving food. It was remembering faces, remembering who liked extra ice and who didn't want pickles on their burger. It was being a therapist for 10 minutes while someone complained about their boss. She glanced up and saw the bell above the door ring. A man walked in. He looked out of place among the construction guys and office workers. He was wearing an expensive wool coat, even though it wasn't that cold outside, and he held a cane like it was a precious object. He looked around the room with wide, lost eyes. Like a bird that had flown into a window and was stunned, Alina watched him walk slowly to the back corner booth. She recognized him immediately. He came in maybe once or twice a week. He always sat in that same spot, in the shadows where the light was dim. He never talked much. He usually just ordered black coffee and stared out the window, looking sad. The other girls who worked there called him the composer because he had long, elegant fingers, and the way he held his head made him look important. They tried to avoid his table because he was so quiet and serious. It made them feel awkward, like they were disturbing a church service. But Alina didn't mind the quiet ones. Usually, they were the ones who needed the most kindness. She grabbed a coffee pot and a menu and headed toward his booth. As she got closer, she noticed something was different today. Usually, he sat very still, his hands resting on the table or his lap. Today, he was fidgeting. He looked pale, and there was a thin line of sweat on his forehead despite the cool air. He was breathing fast, almost like he had just run a marathon, though he had only walked from the door. She stopped at the edge of the table. "Afternoon," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. "Coffee." The man looked up, startled. His eyes were red around the edges. He stared at her for a second, blinking as if he was trying to figure out where he was. Then he nodded his head quickly. "Yes, black. Please." His voice was shaky, barely a whisper. Alina poured the coffee into the mug that was already on the table. The dark liquid swirled. She saw that his hands were gripping the edge of the table so hard, his knuckles were turning white. "You okay, hun?" Alina asked. It wasn't just politeness. She was genuinely worried. He looked like he was about to shatter into a million pieces. He didn't answer right away. He looked back down at his hands. Alina was about to walk away to give him some space, to let him drink his coffee and calm down. But then she heard it. It was a sound that almost got lost in the noise of the diner. It was a soft sound, repetitive. Tap dash, tap dash, tap, tap, tap. Alina froze. She looked at his fingers on the table. They weren't just gripping the edge anymore. They were moving. His index finger and middle finger were dancing against the formica table. They weren't twitching randomly. They had a rhythm. It was a steady, precise beat. Tap dash, tap dash, tap pause, tap tap. He was humming too. It was so low that she almost couldn't hear it over the sound of the dishwasher in the back. But it was there. A low, vibrating hum that matched the tapping of his fingers. It was a strange sight. Here was this old man, dressed in a fancy coat, sitting in a messy diner, acting like he was playing a grand piano on a plastic table. Most people would have thought he was crazy. Most people would have rolled their eyes and walked away. But Alina didn't. She watched his fingers. There was something about that rhythm. It pulled at her, like a hook in her chest. It felt familiar. It felt like a memory she hadn't thought about in 20 years. It made her think of Sunday mornings and steam rising from a radiator. It made her think of her mother. She stood there for a long moment, holding the coffee pot in midair. The lunch rush was swirling around her. A customer at a nearby table was waving his hand, trying to get her attention for a refill. The bell was dinging as new people came in. But for Alina, the world narrowed down to that small booth in the corner. The man let out a frustrated sigh and stopped his fingers. He put his head in his hands, looking defeated. It broke Alina's heart. She had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who was losing a battle against themselves. "Is there anything else I can get you?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "Maybe some pie? We have fresh apple today." The man shook his head without looking up. "No," he said, his voice muffled by his hands. I just need to find it." "Find what?" Alina asked, before she could stop herself. She wasn't supposed to pry. She was supposed to serve the food and clear the table. But she couldn't help it. The tapping had touched something deep inside her. The man lifted his head slowly. His eyes were wet. He looked at Alina, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the kindness in her eyes, the tiredness in her face. He saw a person, not just a waitress. The ending, he whispered. He motioned to the table. I can hear the beginning. I can feel the middle, but it won't finish. The experts, they tell me it isn't real. But it is. I know it is. He looked down at his hand again. He tapped the rhythm one more time. Tap dash tap dash tap, pause, tap tap. Suddenly a picture flashed into Elena's mind. It was so clear it made her dizzy. She saw a small, cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper. She saw a woman with sore knees and rough hands, scrubbing a floor by hand. That woman was humming a song. She was singing a song that didn't have any words, just a melody. And she was moving her hands against the floor in time with the music, making the hard work look like a dance. Elena was a little girl again, sitting on a chair, watching her mother. The memory was gone as fast as it came, but the feeling stayed. The rhythm the man was tapping, that was the exact rhythm her mother used to scrub the floor too. It was the same hum. Elena blinked, surprised. She hadn't thought about that song in decades. She had forgotten it existed until this very second. How could this man, this wealthy stranger, know the song her mother used to sing? It didn't make sense. She looked at the coffee pot in her hand, then back at the man. She realized that the noise of the diner, the smell of the grease, and the feeling of the floor under her shoes, it all connected. This wasn't just a melody to him. It was a life. She felt a sudden, strong urge to tell him. She wasn't an expert. She didn't know about music theory or fancy pianos, but she knew that song. She knew it in her bones. I'm going to take my break, Elena said suddenly to no one in particular. She poured the rest of the coffee into his cup and set the pot down on the counter. The other waitress, a younger girl named Amy, looked at her with wide eyes. Elena, it's the rush. I can't handle all these tables. Just give me 5 minutes, Elena said, her voice firm. She took off her apron and threw it behind the counter. She wasn't thinking about the customers, or the tips, or the angry manager. She was thinking about the man in the corner who was about to cry. She walked back to the booth and sat down opposite him. The man looked surprised. He stiffened, as if he wanted to run away. He wasn't used to people sitting with him. You don't have to do this, he said quickly. I'm fine. No, you're not, Elena said gently. She leaned across the table, resting her arms on the surface. She looked him right in the eye. You're playing the midnight waltz. The old man just stared at her. The noise of the diner, the clinking spoons, the shouting cooks. The loud laughter from the group of truckers seemed to stop for a second. It was as if someone had pressed a mute button on the whole world, leaving just the two of them in that plastic booth. Arthur's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He looked at Elena, his eyes wide and searching. He was trying to figure out if she was making fun of him. He was used to people looking at him with pity. He was used to doctors looking at him like a puzzle that couldn't be solved. But this was different. She was looking at him like she knew a secret. What did you say? Arthur finally whispered. His voice cracked, sounding dry and brittle. Elena leaned back a little bit, crossing her arms over her chest. She wasn't nervous. She felt a strange sort of calmness, like she was floating in a familiar dream. The midnight waltz, she said again, enunciating the words clearly. That is the song you are tapping. Arthur shook his head slowly, a look of deep confusion washing over his face. He reached out and grabbed the digital recorder from the pocket of his coat. His hands were shaking so badly that he almost dropped it on the table. No, he said, his voice getting a little louder. That is impossible. That is, it's not a real song. I mean, it's a song, but it's lost. I played it for the best musicians in the city. I played it for professors. They all said it was just a mess. They said it was a jumble of notes that didn't belong together. He looked down at the recorder, then back up at Elena. Are you sure? You aren't just saying that to be kind? Elena smiled, but it wasn't a mocking smile. It was a sad, soft smile. I don't know anything about music theory, sir. I don't know notes or scales or any of that fancy stuff, but I know what I hear. And that rhythm? That heavy beat and that light, floating top part? That is the Midnight Waltz. She reached across the table and pointed a calloused finger at his hand. My mother, she played that tune. She didn't have a piano. We couldn't afford one. We barely afforded the rent for our apartment. But she would play it on the kitchen table while she was kneading bread dough. She would hum it while she was hanging up the laundry to dry in the bathroom. Arthur stopped breathing for a moment. She played it. On a table? Yes, Elena said. She taught it to me when I was a little girl. I must have been 6 or 7 years old. It was the only thing she ever taught me about music. She told me, Elena, this song is magic. It turns hard work into dancing. Elena laughed a little, a short, breathy sound. I used to think she made that up just to get me to do my chores. But when I hear you tapping it, I can see her. I can see the kitchen. I can smell the yeast. Arthur put the recorder down slowly. He felt a chill run down his spine, but it wasn't a cold chill. It was electric. This woman, this stranger in a pink uniform, was describing a feeling he hadn't been able to put into words for months. He had felt that the song had a purpose, that it was meant to comfort, but he had thought it was just his own memory tricking him. I wrote it, Arthur whispered, the realization hitting him like a wave. I think I wrote it a long, long time ago, but I couldn't remember where it came from. I thought maybe I had stolen it from somewhere. You didn't steal it, Elena said firmly. It's yours. But it's hers now, too. Songs travel like that, you know? They float from person to person. She looked around the diner to make sure nobody was watching them. The rush was still going on, but nobody was paying attention to the corner booth. When you were tapping just now, I felt like I was a little girl again, sitting on a high chair watching her. I haven't thought about that song in 30 years. But it was there, hiding in my head, waiting for you to knock on the door. Arthur's eyes filled with tears. They spilled over and ran down his wrinkled cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. He was too afraid to move, afraid that if he moved, the moment would break. The experts had analyzed the sound waves. They had looked at the structure of the melody, but they had missed the heart of it. They missed the feeling because they were looking for perfection in a computer program. Elena found it because she was looking for a memory. You said you know the rest, Arthur said, his voice urgent now. He leaned forward, almost knocking over his coffee cup. Please, the experts said it didn't resolve. They said the harmony was wrong. I can only hear the first part, and then it fades away. I need to know how it ends. I need to know what happens next. He looked at her with such desperation. It was the look of a man drowning who had just been thrown a rope. If I don't finish it, I feel like I will lose my mind. It is like an itch I can't scratch. It is like a word on the tip of my tongue that won't come out. Elena looked at him closely. She saw the terror in his eyes. She realized that this wasn't just about a song for him. It was about holding on to who he was. If he forgot the song, he was afraid he would forget himself. I can help you, Elena said softly. But you have to close your eyes. Arthur blinked. What? Close your eyes, she repeated. Stop looking at the recorder. Stop looking at the table. Just listen. You are trying too hard to find it with your brain. You need to find it with your ears. And you need to let me in. Arthur hesitated. He was a logical man. He believed in sheet music and metronomes. But he had tried logic, and logic had failed him. He had tried the experts, and they had sent him away. Now, he was sitting in a diner with a waitress who claimed to know the music of his past. Slowly, Arthur closed his eyes. The darkness was scary at first, but then he heard Elena's voice. It was a grounding sound, steady and warm. Yeah. Okay, Elena said. She took a deep breath. She looked at the man in front of her, this broken genius, and she decided to give him the best gift she had. She was going to give him back his song. She didn't start singing right away. She started humming. It was low and soft at first, testing the waters. Hum-meme, Arthur gasped. Yes, that is it. That is the beginning. Elena kept going. She hummed the melody he had been tapping. It was a simple tune, melancholy but sweet. But then, she did something the experts couldn't do. She added the feeling. She added the soul. She didn't just hit the notes perfectly. She let her voice slide a little bit, just the way her mother used to do. She added a wobble here, a pause there, mimicking the sound of a tired but happy woman humming while she worked. She reached the point where Arthur always got stuck. The music rose up, tense and unresolved, waiting for the answer. Arthur held his breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his fingers turned white. He was waiting for the silence, waiting for the fade that always drove him crazy. But the silence didn't come. Elena took a breath and sang the next line. Her voice was clear now, cutting through the noise of the diner. The melody turned, not upward into a complicated classical mess, but downward. It resolved into a warm major chord. It sounded like a sigh of relief. It sounded like coming home after a long walk in the rain. Da-da-dum, da-da-dum. Arthur let out a sob. It was a loud, ugly sound that shocked the people at the next table. But he didn't care. The melody had landed. The question had been answered. The tension in his chest, which had been building up for months, suddenly snapped and released. It felt like a physical weight being lifted off his shoulders. That is it, he cried, opening his eyes. Tears were streaming down his face, dripping onto his white shirt. That is the ending. The resolution. It turns to F major. It's so simple. Why couldn't I see it? Why couldn't they see it? Elena stopped humming. She looked at the crying old man and felt a lump in her own throat. Because they were looking for math, she said gently. They were looking for something complicated. But this song, it isn't complicated. It's just a waltz. It's just a way to get through the night. Arthur reached out and covered Elena's hand with his. His skin was paper thin and spotted with age, but his grip was surprisingly strong. Thank you, he choked out. You have no idea what you have done for me. Elena squeezed his hand back. I think I do, she said. My mom used to say that music is the best medicine for a heavy heart. I think she was right. For a minute they just sat there. The diner was still loud. The cashier was ringing up orders. The bell on the door was dinging constantly, but in that corner booth there was peace. The mystery was solved. Not by a computer, not by a professor, but by a memory that lived in the heart of a waitress. The air in the booth felt different now. It was lighter, as if a heavy storm had just passed over and the sun was finally trying to break through the clouds. Arthur sat there, staring at Elena, his eyes wide and glistening. He didn't look like a famous composer anymore. He didn't look like an expert on music theory. He just looked like a man who had been wandering in the desert for years and had finally been handed a cup of water. He reached out with a trembling hand and grabbed the digital voice recorder. It had been sitting on the table like a useless brick, but now it felt important again. He fumbled with the buttons, his thick fingers slipping on the plastic. He was in a panic, afraid that the song would leave his mind before he could capture it this time. He was afraid that Elena would stop humming, or that he would forget the beautiful way she had resolved the melody. "Wait, Arthur," said his voice urgent and breathless. "Wait, please. I need you to do it again. I have to record it. I have to get it down." Elena looked at him with gentle eyes. She wasn't annoyed that he was asking. She could see how much this meant to him. It wasn't just about a song anymore. It was about his sanity. "Okay," she said softly. "Take your time." Arthur managed to hit the red record button. A small light blinked on. He held the device up, pointing the microphone toward her. His hand was shaking, making the recorder wobble in the air. "Please," he whispered. "From the top. If you can." Elena took a deep breath. She leaned back against the red vinyl of the booth and closed her eyes. She needed to go back to that place in her memory. She needed to see the small kitchen, smell the soap her mother used, and feel the rough texture of the kitchen table. She started to hum. It was a low, steady sound that rose above the noise of the diner. At first it was just a rhythm. Then the melody came. It was sad but strong, like a tree growing through concrete. Arthur watched her face as she hummed. He wasn't looking at the recorder. He was watching her expression. It was peaceful. She was tapping her fingers on the table, just like he had been doing earlier, but her fingers were sure of themselves. They knew exactly where to go. There was no hesitation. She hummed the part that had been torturing him for weeks, the part where the music seemed to climb and climb, getting more and more tense. The experts had said this part was broken. They said it didn't make sense because it didn't follow the rules they learned in school. But as Alina hummed it, Arthur realized they were wrong. It wasn't broken. It was just holding its breath. It was the sound of waiting for something good to happen. Then she reached the turn. She changed the tune. She brought it down, resolving the tension into a warm, sweet chord. It was the note he had been desperate to find. It felt like a door unlocking. It felt like a hug after a long, lonely day. Arthur let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for months. He slumped back against the booth, tears rolling freely down his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. He didn't care who saw him. He was listening to the music, but he was also hearing something else. He was hearing the past. "That is it," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "That is the missing piece. It resolves in the major key. It's hope." The song is about hope. Alina stopped humming. She opened her eyes and looked at him. The diner was still loud around them, the clatter of plates, shouting of orders, but the space between them felt quiet and sacred. "You did it," Arthur said. He set the recorder down on the table very carefully, like it was made of gold. He reached across the table and took Elena's hands in his. His hands were soft and old, while hers were rough and warm from years of work. "You solved it in 60 seconds. The experts. They had this machine for weeks. They analyzed the sound waves. They told me I was losing my mind. They told me the song was a hallucination." He squeezed her hands tight. "But you knew. You knew because you felt it. That is what music is supposed to be. It isn't math. It isn't rules. It is feeling. It is human connection." Elena felt a lump in her throat. She looked down at their joined hands. "It was just a song my mother liked," she said, feeling a bit shy. She didn't know much about fancy music. She just knew what made her heart feel lighter. "She knew a lot more than the experts then," Arthur said. "I wrote that melody, Alina. I am sure of it now. I wrote it when I was a young man, maybe when I was poor and struggling, before I became famous. I think I wrote it for a time like this. But I forgot the ending. I forgot that after the hard part, there is supposed to be peace. You reminded me." He laughed, a wet, shaky sound. "I came here feeling like my life was over. I felt like my brain was turning into mush. But you gave me back my song. You gave me back a piece of my soul." Alina squeezed his hands back. "I'm just glad I could help, Arthur. Really? When I saw you tapping today, it was like a sign. Like I was supposed to be here to help you finish it." "It is a miracle," Arthur said firmly. "That is what it is." He looked at the recorder, then back at her. "Can you do it one more time? So I can have it safe? Just to be sure?" "Of course," Elena said. She hummed the melody again. This time, Arthur closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. He didn't need to record it anymore, not really, because it was locked inside him now. But he wanted to keep her voice on that tape. He wanted to keep the sound of the woman who had saved him. As she hummed the final note, Arthur felt a shift inside him. The fear that had been living in his chest, the cold, dark fear of losing his memory, began to shrink. It didn't go away completely, but it became smaller. It became manageable. He realized that even if his mind faded, even if he forgot other things, this moment was real. He had been heard. He had been understood. Elena finished the song and opened her eyes. Arthur opened his eyes too. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. There was a bond between them now that didn't need words. It was a bond forged in music and empathy. Two people from completely different worlds, a rich composer and a hardworking waitress connected by a simple tune that survived through time. "Thank you," Arthur said again. His voice was stronger now. It sounded more like the old Arthur. "You're welcome," Elena said. She noticed that the line of customers at the counter was getting long, and the other waitress was looking around frantically. "I have to get back to work, Arthur. The lunch rush isn't going to wait." "Go," Arthur said, letting go of her hands. "Go save the diner." Lena stood up and smoothed her apron. She looked down at the old man one last time. He looked different. His shoulders weren't slumped anymore. He sat up straighter. He looked like a man who had just remembered how to live. "You finish your coffee?" she said, smiling. "It's on the house today." Arthur watched her walk away. He watched her go back behind the counter, pick up a pot of coffee, and start taking orders. She moved with grace, handling the chaos of the diner with ease. To everyone else in the room, she was just the lady bringing the food. But to Arthur, she was a genius. She was the most brilliant musician he had met in a long time. He picked up his coffee cup and took a sip. It was black and bitter, just the way he liked it. But as he swallowed it, it didn't taste bitter. It tasted like the best thing he had ever drunk. He looked down at the recorder in his hand. He pressed the button to play it back. He heard Elena's voice fill the small speaker. Da-da-dum, da-da-dum. It was a bit crackly because of the recorder, but it was perfect. Arthur sat in the booth for a long time. He didn't look out the window. He didn't watch the people. He just listened to the recording over and over again. And for the first time in months, the noise in his head was gone. The song was complete. He was complete. Arthur sat in the quiet of his own living room later that evening. The house was still. The ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece was the only sound, but unlike before, it didn't make him feel anxious. He didn't feel like the clock was counting down the seconds he had left. It was just a clock. The sun had gone down, and the room was dark, save for a small lamp on the side table. He didn't turn on the big lights. He didn't need to see the certificates on the walls anymore to know who he was. He held the digital recorder in his hand. It felt warm to the touch, perhaps from his hand holding it for so long. He looked at the small screen, thinking about everything that had happened that afternoon. It felt surreal, like a dream. He had walked into the diner feeling like a defeated old man, ready to give up on his own mind. He walked out feeling like he had been reborn. Arthur knew he could take the recording to a studio. He could hire musicians to play Elena's humming note for note. He could write it down on sheet music, adding the complex harmonies and orchestrations he was famous for. He could turn the Midnight Waltz into a big symphony. He could probably win awards for it. The critics would praise him for his return to form and his emotional depth. They would analyze the structure and talk about how brilliant the composition was. But as he sat there in the dim light, Arthur realized he would never do that. He pressed the play button on the recorder. Elena's voice filled the room. It was a bit fuzzy because of the cheap microphone in the device. In the background, you could hear the faint clatter of dishes and the roar of a coffee machine. You could hear a truck driver laughing at a nearby booth. None of it was polished. It wasn't studio quality. It was messy and raw. But to Arthur, it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard in his life. He listened to the hum. He listened to the way her voice slid over the notes, not caring about being perfect, just caring about the feeling. She had captured the soul of the song in a way that no expert ever could. She had captured the sound of a mother scrubbing a floor to make life better for her daughter. She had captured the sound of resilience. Arthur realized that if he orchestrated this, if he added violins and cellos and drums, he would ruin it. He would be covering up the magic with too much noise. The perfection of the song was in its simplicity. It wasn't meant for a grand concert hall. It belonged in a small kitchen, in a cramped diner. In the places where real people lived and worked and struggled, he smiled to himself. For the first time in his career, he decided not to compose. He decided to leave the song exactly as it was. He put the recorder down on the table next to the photograph of his own mother, a woman he hadn't thought about enough in recent years. Looking at the photo now, he wondered if she had hummed that song to him when he was a baby. Maybe that was where the melody came from. Maybe he hadn't written it at all. Maybe he had just remembered it. It didn't matter anymore. The ownership of the song wasn't important. Arthur stood up from his chair. He walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain. Outside, the streetlights were on. The world was still turning. He wasn't afraid of the future anymore. He knew that his memory might still get worse. He knew that there might come a day when he forgot his own name or the faces of the people he loved. That was a scary thought, but it wasn't the end. He knew now that the things he valued, the true, important things, didn't just live in his brain. They lived in the hearts of other people. He had written a song, or heard a song and lost it. But it wasn't gone. It was waiting in the memory of a woman he had never met before today. It was safe. The next morning, Arthur went back to the diner. He walked a little slower than he used to, but he stood a little taller. He wasn't carrying his cane today. He wore a simple sweater and slacks. When he walked in, the bell dinged. The lunch rush hadn't started yet, so it was fairly quiet. Alina was behind the counter, filling the sugar dispensers. She looked up when the door opened. Her face broke into a wide, genuine smile when she saw him. "Well, look who's back," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good morning, Alina," Arthur said. His voice was steady. He walked over to the counter and sat on one of the red stools. "I came for the coffee," he said, "and to say thank you again." Alina poured him a cup, black, just the way he liked it. "Did you get it all recorded?" she asked. "I did," Arthur said, "and I listened to it all night. I wanted to ask you something, though." "Sure, anything," Alina said, leaning on the counter. "I wanted to know if your mother had a name for that song," Arthur asked. "Other than the Midnight Waltz," Alina thought for a moment, looking up at the ceiling as she tried to remember. "You know, I don't think she ever called it anything. She just hummed it. If she did have a name for it, she never said it out loud." Arthur nodded slowly. "Then let's keep it that way. Some things don't need names. They just need to be felt." He took a sip of his coffee. It tasted perfect. He looked around the diner. He saw the young waitress, Amy, bussing tables. He saw the cook flipping eggs on the grill. He saw an old man reading a newspaper in the corner. It was just a normal Tuesday, but to Arthur, it felt extraordinary. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. He pushed it across the counter toward Alina. "What is this?" Alina asked, looking down at it. "It's not for you," Arthur said quickly. "It's for your children. Or if you don't have children, for you. It's for the music school in town, for a scholarship. I want kids who love music but can't afford lessons to have a chance. The experts. They have enough money. They have enough chances. I want to help the people who have the music in their hearts, but not the money in their pockets." Alina looked at the envelope, then back at Arthur. Her eyes got wide. "Arthur, this is too much. I can't take this." "You aren't taking it," Arthur said firmly. "You are giving it. You taught me that music isn't about the notes on the page. It's about the life behind the notes. Let this help someone else live their life a little better." Lena picked up the envelope. Her hands were shaking a little bit. She looked like she wanted to argue, but she saw the look in his eyes. She saw that he needed to do this. So she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "I will make sure it goes to the right place." "Good," Arthur said. He finished his coffee and stood up. He didn't feel the need to rush home anymore. He didn't feel the need to hide away. "I'll see you later, Elena," he said. "See you, Arthur," she said. Arthur walked to the door. He paused for a second, his hand on the handle. He looked back at Alina, who was already busy putting the envelope away safely. He thought about the song. He thought about how it had traveled from his mind into the air, into Elena's mother's memory, into Elena's heart, and finally back to him. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the bright sunlight. The air was crisp and cool. He took a deep breath and exhaled. As he walked down the street, he didn't tap his cane. He didn't hum the melody. He didn't need to. He just walked. He knew the song was there, floating in the ether, safe and sound. It wasn't a puzzle to be solved anymore. It was just a beautiful part of life, and for the first time in a long time, Arthur was happy to just be living it.